Good morning, all. Welcome to the second day of FDP workshop on computer science and biology. Now I request Dr. S.L. Bhagat to introduce today's speaker one, Dr. S.S. Bhagwat sir. Sir.
Good morning to all the participants for the second day of the session. Today we have an eminent speaker, Professor S.S. Bhagwat sir, professor at UD City, Mumbai. He has an additional charge of IUPAC cell also. He is a well combination with industry as well as academics. He has well connect as a life member with Indian Institute of Chemical Engineers, Oil Technology Association of India, Society for Industrial Chemistry, and Indian Society for Surface Science and Technology. He is on the editorial board of Industrial and Engineering Chemistry, American Chemical Society, Journal of Surface Science and Technology, and he is the organizing secretary for IICHE ChemCon 2012. He has 93 papers published and his Google citation has cost 1500. He's also awarded with Best Teacher Awards 8 times consecutively, and he is also awarded with UGC BSR Award, NOSEL Award for Design, and he is awarded as a Distinguished Speaker for ChemCon in 2014. I wish that his motivational talk will be very helpful to us, as his topic for today's presentation is chemical engineering thermodynamics, which is the base of our chemical engineering. Welcome to Dr. Bhagwat sir. Good morning, sir.
Good morning. Good morning to you all, and it's a pleasure talking to colleagues. I'm sure many of you are experienced people teaching chemical engineering, but perhaps there are some of you who are younger than me and less experienced as well. But at the same time, I'm fully aware that there would be some who are even more experienced than me and would be able to add a lot to what I am saying as well. But still, thank you, Patil sir, for that nice introduction. And it's the new norm that all of us are sitting at our home attending an FDP or attending a lecture. And completely new experience for all of us in the last 6 months, that instead of seeing student faces, we barely see their names. And sometimes, occasionally, if we are lucky, we get to see their camera face. And we have only now become somewhat used to talking to camera instead of talking to people. I'm aware that all of us have gone through that transformation in the last 6-8 months, that we normally require a feedback from faces. Instead of that, we have learned to talk to camera. I am reminded of the times that we earlier used to look at somebody talking on his mobile phone with the earphones plugged, as if what kind of a mad person is he? Is he talking to himself? But today we are all doing that, talking to a computer which is impersonal and does not give any reaction for most of the time. And a lot of times we are not even sure whether our students are sitting in front of us or they have got up and gone for a cup of tea. Since you fully empathize with this problem that we all of us face, can I request all of you to put your camera on and at least let me see your faces? You need not, of course, start your microphones, but if you can start your camera, I'll at least get to see some faces and how you're responding to what I'm saying. So very good morning to you all, and hope to see some faces instead of only names and photographs, because all of us know that many of us don't look like our display photographs in WhatsApp or in the email display photos that we have. We look different. We look better than the other photographs, but not like our display photographs. So whatever is that in between, I would like to see if you can switch your cameras on, please. I think somebody has raised his hands. Who will enable the mic for somebody who is raising hand? Patil sir?
Madam Varela, she has raised a hand, but I don't know actually she want to ask something or just by mistake she has done.
Good morning, sir. It was like unknowingly I have clicked over that. I'm sorry for that.
Oh, okay. That's fine. That's fine. But if you can start your cameras, it will help me to see whether you are able to follow what I am saying? Are you with me, or is it that I am only talking to a camera with nobody sitting in front of it? You know the feel that we get when students don't have their cameras on. So I would request all of you to cooperate and, as far as possible, have your cameras on. I'm aware that not everybody will be having a connectivity where you can do that, nor would you be probably in a setup where you can have your camera on. But if possible, please do it. Right. The subject that I am going to deal with today, chemical engineering thermodynamics, is something which, if you ask an undergraduate student or recent graduate, which was the subject that scared him or her most, it is probably the thermodynamics subject, because it is considered a very abstract subject, considered something where a lot of derivations, and the first thing that hits you is a lot of symbols, confusing symbols, between different books, different symbols, a huge number of equations. Many of them are given in the books directly, and we don't know where they come from. And the student ends up as a very confused individual while dealing with thermodynamics. That's a very common scenario. And you talk about our community, the teachers. If you find out in an institute how many would be willing to teach thermodynamics, you would typically find a fairly small number compared to people opting for, let's say, fluid flow or heat transfer. Now, not to say that those subjects are any less important, but perhaps they are perceived as subjects easier to teach, and by students as subjects easier to understand. And therefore, those of us who decide to take up thermodynamics teaching, one of the first responsibilities we have is to dispel wrong notions about thermodynamics that students have to begin with. One of the first things is that subject is abstract. And second thing, that it is a very difficult subject. Indeed, both are not true. It is a very, very applied subject. And it is, once you follow the basic principles, it is fairly easy as a subject too. We have to understand that we use thermodynamics to understand phenomena, which without that would be very difficult to understand. And once we look at it as a tool to understand something, we will not look at it as something complex, but something to make complex observations simpler to understand. In fact, if you ask the students, is this the first thermodynamics subject that you are having? Some of them may say that they had a course on physical chemistry in which thermodynamics was introduced. In some of the institutes, they may say that we had a mechanical engineering course where some thermodynamics was introduced. What it actually tells us is that it is the story of that elephant seen by 4 blind men. One person feels that the elephant is a flat surface, other person feels it's like a tube, third person feels it's like a bush, depending on whether you have touched the tail, the trunk, or the back of that elephant. Thermodynamics is that kind of an elephant. It has so many facets and features that depending on who is looking at it and for what purpose, you would perceive it differently. And if you ask them, was it any subject course that you have had so far where it was entirely thermodynamics, not a part of physical chemistry or part of mechanical engineering subject? They will all probably uniformly answer no. And then if you ask them, what do you recall about thermodynamics? What is the earliest thing or most basic thing that you remember about thermodynamics? Then all of them are most likely to say the first law of thermodynamics, the law of conservation of energy and law of conservation of mass. We of course know that that came in the 19th century. It was given by Clapeyron and Clausius as a statement, really speaking. And thermodynamics began more than 100 years before that with the steam engine, Newcomen's steam engine, followed by the James Watt modifications and Nicolas Sadi-Carnot observations that some heat has to be rejected, not all the heat can be converted into mechanical power. But they feel first law of thermodynamics is the first thing in thermodynamics. No, the laws were constituted much later after some of the observations. And probably the story began with Nicolas Sadi-Carnot making that observation that part of the heat has to be returned to atmosphere and only a part of that heat gets converted to mechanical work. And that began because of the steam engine, which was required to create mechanical work beyond what muscles can produce. Before that, all the mechanical work was either done by human muscles or animal muscles. And it was as a replacement or augmentation of what muscles can do that engines came into place. First one being, of course, either the windmills, the water mills, and then the steam engine. Now in windmills and water mills, it is the mechanical energy itself which is converted to another form of mechanical energy. Whereas once we talk about the word engine, we are talking about conversion of heat as an energy into mechanical form of energy. And if you ask the students, are you really sure that this is the first full-fledged thermodynamics course that they are doing? They would still not realize that they had a course which was not titled Chemical Engineering Thermodynamics 0, but it was actually a course entirely based on just the statement of the first law of thermodynamics. The law of conservation of mass and the law of conservation of energy is the basis of the course on what we call stoichiometry or material and energy balances. But most students don't realize that it is a thermodynamics course. Once you make it clear to them that, look, it is a course based on purely applications of first law of thermodynamics, then they realize how vast the applications of contents in thermodynamics are. Just the first law has an entire subject dedicated to it. Naturally, the subsequent things in thermodynamics deserve as much attention and have as many applications, at least, as the material energy balance. And we all know material and energy balance is the starting point for learning chemical engineering. If you are in institutes where there are other engineering programs, that is one subject which distinguishes your students from mechanical or electrical or civil engineering students. Material balance and energy balance is a view which is taken by chemical engineers in a very unique way. We do those material balances, we talk about reactions and do elemental balances. All of it is simply law of conservation of mass. And then if you ask them, while solving those problems, you have always solved material balance problems separately and energy balance problems separately. But the law of conservation states that mass can be converted to energy, energy into mass, but not be created or destroyed. So why do you have only law of conservation of mass? And why do you have only law of conservation of energy? Many of them think when carbon burns to give you carbon dioxide, that is where some mass gets converted to energy. And you have to then explain that carbon getting converted to carbon dioxide is entirely a play of electrons going from one atom to another atom or getting shared between atoms, and nothing is happening to the nucleus. And as long as nothing happens to the nucleus, mass does not change at all. So the mass is entirely conserved in a chemical reaction, and it is only nuclear reactions that convert mass into energy. So, and if you exclude nuclear reactions from your study, then you can segregate the energy balance from material balance. Conversion of one form of energy to another is possible. Conversion of one type of compound to another is possible, but not conversion of one element to another, which happens only with nuclear transformations. And it is only there that mass can get converted to energy. Otherwise, all the chemical reactions producing heat or absorbing heat, it is no transformation in mass, no change in mass. And that is why we can write the mass balance equation separately and energy balance equation separately. But that is a thermodynamics 0 course is very rarely realized by students. But that is what we have to say to ensure that their fear of thermodynamics goes away in the first lecture itself. That we have already done one full course on thermodynamics, and what we are learning now is just the second course. So with this, I will start with my presentation, which I am going to take you through what we learn in ICT, at least in 2 different courses on chemical engineering thermodynamics. We all realize that thermodynamics is a subject which began and was started by mechanical engineers. And yet, physical chemists and chemical engineers added a lot to it. The field of chemical engineering may have started towards the end of 19th century, but a lot of the thermodynamics development happened as physical chemistry before chemical engineering was born. We have to explain the chronology of the events of how Nicolas Sadi Carnot made an observation about heat being not converted fully to mechanical energy, how Clausius then formulated a principle that Q upon T is the phenomena that we have to look at, and Q upon T given to an engine can be equal to Q upon T given out by an engine. And usually, engine which operate give out more Q upon T than the Q upon T received by them. And it is this Q upon T that he called entropy. Entropy is one of the most intriguing concepts for new learners of thermodynamics. But if you introduce them as a means of explaining the observation, indeed, that is how it came in Clausius's mind. So much so that Clausius thought he has found a new entity and he can give it his name. So he had for many years a unit for calories per Kelvin. He used to call it 1 Clausius. But that didn't survive too long. And within 10-15 years, it became just calories per Kelvin, calories per degree Celsius. So Clausius and his contribution, and then the combination of Boyle's law, Charles' law into a single uniform, what we then now call the ideal gas equation, along with the kinetic theory of gases, owes its existence to Clapeyron. And then Clausius and Clapeyron together working on the change of boiling point of a compound with pressure, giving the Clausius and Clapeyron equation. And after them came the biggest impact maker in chemical engineering thermodynamics, Josiah Willard Gibbs. And when you explain the chronology of how it came, that with Gibbs being the first PhD in engineering in the United States, he gave out a lot of the equations that we talk of today. But even then, these equations would have been lost to us, just like Carnot's work would have been lost to the world had it not been for Clausius. Gibbs's work would have been lost to chemical engineers had it not been for Guggenheim and Lewis and Randall in the beginning of 20th century writing book with a title Chemical Engineering Thermodynamics by the Method of Josiah Willard Gibbs. And it is in that book that we have the origin of a lot of the concepts of chemical engineering thermodynamics the way we use today. So once we give them the evolution, they start getting interested in why things happen. And once you get them thinking about why things happen, then the interest is less in some abstract part of the concept, and it is more about using it and thinking about what answers it can give rather than what questions it poses. And once it starts answering questions about things, then it becomes a friend subject rather than an enemy subject that many of the students perceives it to be. So thermodynamics is basically about why things happen. Nature has things happening, and certain things do not happen at all. And those which happen, why do they happen? And why do they happen only to a certain extent is what thermodynamics tries to answer. Also, in chemical engineering, the rates of processes are always written as driving force divided by resistance and multiplied by the size of the equipment in which the process is being done. So for a reactor, it is volume. For a heat transfer equipment, it is the heat transfer area. For a mass transfer equipment, it is the mass transfer area, which denotes the size. The reciprocal of resistance is usually called the coefficient or the rate constant. And the driving force then is the part which is coming from thermodynamics. What is the extent up to which it can happen, and what is the extent to which it is already standing on? The difference is the driving force. Be it the temperature, be it the concentrations. We talk about A star minus A naught, you talk about T minus T2, T1 minus T2. All these driving forces are because of thermodynamics telling us how much of it can happen. And unless we have a driving force in hand, there is no way we can talk about a rate. And of course, when you talk about distillation as a method of separation, you are talking about materials being at equilibrium. You always begin with a YX diagram, drawn simply with the relative volatility number, but that is not the best representation of vapor-liquid equilibrium. And that thermodynamics gives the true representation of a substance or a pair of substance YX diagrams. And just because it is easier to learn distillation with a given alpha, you learn it that way. But the real YX diagram should be made using thermodynamics. Once you explain that, thermodynamics starts becoming an interesting subject. So why things happen the way they do, and who gains from it? What is the benefit from it? That is the way to look at how thermodynamics evolves. Are you all able to see the screen that I am displaying in full screen mode, or are you seeing it only as a small part?
In full screen mode only, sir.
Okay, fine. Thanks. Why I have to ask is I am not doing it from my office or my computer or my home. I am currently in another town, just came yesterday night, and I'm doing it from somebody else's place. Anyway, thank you. So chemical engineering thermodynamics and thermodynamics alone are somewhat different things. Thermodynamics has its origin in mechanical engineering. Thermo and dynamics itself explains that. Thermo means heat, dynamics means movement. So heat causing something to move, something mechanical form of energy. So heat transformed into movement is basically thermodynamics. And the use of chemical engineering thermodynamics is primarily for the design and performance of chemical and process equipment. And many of these processes may go to completion or may not go to completion. They may involve chemical reactions, may not involve chemical reactions. So like nitrogen, hydrogen giving ammonia is a chemical reaction which does not go to completion. Absorption of CO2 in monoethanol amine is partially reaction, partially physical, and that also does not absorb all of the carbon dioxide. If you want to extract acetic acid from water by toluene, then part of the acetic acid gets extracted, and the distribution coefficient at which it stops comes from thermodynamics. If there is a solution, whether there will be precipitation or more solid can dissolve in it, again depends on the solid liquid equilibrium thermodynamics. And so the degree to which these things can go to completion is of the importance. And that comes through concept of equilibrium between phases or equilibrium between reactants. And it is equilibrium that was primarily defined in terms of entropy by Clausius, which is what chemical engineering thermodynamics or physical chemistry draws on as the principle coming from mechanical engineering, that generation of entropy is essential for any process to happen. In fact, for any chemical or process plant, lot more attention is for separation processes than the chemical reaction itself. And separations are all limited by equilibrium. And rates of separation processes decide equipment design, and driving force is the primary requirement for that rate of the separation process. And equilibrium is assessed only through thermodynamics. The extension of the mechanical engineering thermodynamics through generation of entropy into deciding whether something will happen or not. This distillation column, which we talk about, at every stage of this distillation column, from bottom plate, in fact, from reboiler bottom plate to the top plate, and in the case of partial condensers, even in the condenser, there is phase equilibrium. So a lot of thermodynamics in chemical engineering is about phase equilibria, but not necessarily all of it. And that phase equilibrium thermodynamics also has to start first with single component thermodynamics, then evolving into multi-component thermodynamics. So I already mentioned and James Steeman and Sadiq Carnot's observation through his monograph, Motive Power of Fire, and Clausius's work, followed by Thomson, Clapeyron, is what we learn today as chemical engineering thermodynamics. And the condition for equilibrium is that nothing can happen spontaneously. And things happen spontaneously when there is positive generation of entropy. No generation of entropy is the case when equilibrium will be reached. Generation of entropy will be when spontaneous process happens. Destruction of entropy cannot happen, at least not on the overall basis. If you feel entropy of some place is reducing, it is because somewhere else it is increasing, and usually the increase is more than the decrease in this place. And we also transform that entropy generation definition, which looks a very abstract property, to the overall extensive Gibbs free energy being reduced through a spontaneous process, that is dg extensive by d time being less than or equal to 0. So decrease in free energy is a requirement for a spontaneous process. And if you allow a process to happen and yet there is no decrease in the Gibbs free energy, if that process happens, then that is the state of equilibrium. So Gibbs energy may be as abstract as entropy in some ways, but there is a way of finding the value of Gibbs free energy difference between one state and another state through what are measurable properties. So most of the thermodynamics exercise is about going from measurables to conceptuals. How do you arrive at the property value, or whether the entropy is getting generated, or whether Gibbs free energy is reducing? This conceptual answer to be obtained from something which can be practically measured is the job of thermodynamics. And then we evolve into du is equal to TdS minus PdV as a simple statement of first law of thermodynamics, where energies can come through 4 possible different ways. Du by d time can happen because of either heat addition or removal, work addition or removal, or the system size expanding or collapsing, or material itself coming in or going out, along with it energy coming in or going out. These are the only 4 ways in which we talk about rate of change of internal energy of a system, and that gives rise to du is equal to dq minus pdv plus w dot, and we then reduce it for a closed system undergoing a reversible process, which we bring in the entropy definition, that q dot upon t is how entropy changes. So dq, which is dq by d time, really gets converted to TdS, and then we get dg is equal to vdp minus sdt once we introduce the definition of g as h minus ts, definition of enthalpy as u plus pv. In fact, many a times, even at the stage of second year chemical engineering, although they have studied what is enthalpy, free energy and entropy in that 10th and 11th and 12th standard, they are not able to grasp that concept. That enthalpy is form of internal energy only that the body will possess if it was allowed to go to zero volume. And because it is occupying some volume, some of that energy has already been spent in creating space for itself against the atmospheric pressure. And that is why the remaining internal energy is less than what it was before it had any volume. And that internal energy before it had occupied any volume conceptually is what is enthalpy. And enthalpy is therefore a higher value. Internal energy is what remains out of that after the volume has been occupied by pushing the surrounding. Now this concept itself we have to explain, although they have studied in 11th and 12th standard. And similarly, H minus Ts as a definition of Gibbs energy, instead of giving it directly, if we give it because it came as a criterion for generation of entropy in a closed system at fixed pressure and temperature, having two phases, then they understand why Gibbs energy is required. And then if you have dG is equal to VdP minus SdT for a reversible process in a closed system, they then understand why we use it for phase equilibrium. In a phase equilibrium system, we have liquid phase, we have vapor phase, and then we say dG is equal to VdP because temperature is same and we are changing the pressure, then dG will be equal to VdP. Then we have to introduce the concept of why total Gibbs free energy goes to a minimum at equilibrium. And once we do that, why the molar Gibbs free energy of the vapor phase and the liquid phase have to be equal at equilibrium condition, where entropy generation will not happen, take place, even if some material evaporates or condenses. Then we talk about the fact that absolute value of energy, Gibbs energy, cannot be found out. And although our condition is G alpha equal to G beta or G vapor is equal to G liquid, we cannot have the absolute value of either of them. But we can have a value of G vapor minus some G reference and G liquid minus the same G reference. And the choice of that reference condition is ideal gas at this pressure and temperature. And as you can see this, we then talk about the vapor phase pressure T being into at pressure 0 or near 0 at the same temperature T. Then ideal gas at 0 pressure and the real fluid at 0 pressure will have the same property. And then the transformation of an ideal gas from 0 pressure to pressure P, it will be governed by different equations. If we are talking about G, then dG is equal to VdP with real phase volume will be giving this transformation. Ideal gas volume gives this transformation. And then we can obtain G of the vapor minus G of ideal gas. G of a liquid similarly minus G of the ideal gas. And if these two are equal, then G vapor is equal to G liquid. And once we connect this with the calculation, they realize why is it molar volume of the vapor or the liquid as a function of pressure and temperature is such an important thing to have equations for. If you are dependent only on volumetric data, experimental numbers of molar volume to do this integration, then it will be very, very unwieldy. And therefore, representing molar volume of materials as a function of pressure temperature is a very valuable entity. And that for an ideal gas molar volume is simply RT upon P, but for the real fluids volume is something different than RT upon P. And finding molar volume of real substances and making equations of them then becomes the next step to explain. And in the next step, we talk about various equations of state. Although it began with van der Waals converting P into V is equal to RT into P plus A by V squared as a correction to pressure, V minus V as a correction to volume, and the product of these two equal to RT. Although van der Waals was the first one to give this equation in 1873, we should also tell them that that equation is not in practical use at all. It is not an accurate equation at all. Nobody uses van der Waals equation today except to explain the concept of real gas equations of state. And the fact that van der Waals also explained with that equation the equilibrium between vapor and liquid through what we call the van der Waals loop. We should here introduce the PV diagram and represent the van der Waals equation on that. 1873 was the year van der Waals developed that equation. He got a Nobel Prize for it almost 27 years later. Not 27, how many? He got it in 37 years later, in 1910. Fortunately, he was alive, otherwise he would have missed it. But that equation is never used by any engineers or for any practical application. And it was only in 1950s that Redlich and Kwong gave a usable equation of state, which is fairly similar to van der Waals, but much more accurate. So we talk about the Redlich-Kwong equation and then its applications to various things. Then the modification of the Redlich-Kwong to make it more accurate, because two-parameter state postulate as given by corresponding state principles as given by van der Waals was only that much accurate, and we require a third parameter, either ZC or omega. So Pitzer's asymmetric factor omega, and then the introduction of the Soave modification of Redlich-Kwong and Peng-Robinson equation. And as a first application of these, we should always talk about this phase equilibrium rather than talking about all these equations which are definitely going to be there. When we talk about phase equilibrium calculation, that is where all these equations of state will be better understood. And once we give all the equations of state, then we should also tell them when we should use which equation of state. That RT upon P is the criterion which will tell us which equation of state to use. If RT upon P is greater than 20-25 liters per mole, even ideal gas equation is good. If that value is greater than 5 liters per mole, it is still mildly non-ideal, and I can use the truncated form of the virial equation. But if it is anything less than that, I need the cubic form of equations. And even the cubic forms are not very accurate. You require something like Benedict-Webb-Rubin when it comes to polar substances or even lower volumes, and even that is insufficient to describe steam for which we do turbine calculations, and we require extreme accuracy there. And therefore Keenan equation, which came in 1928 having some 20-30 parameters, was used for steam, and even that was considered inadequate. And in 1995 the International Association for Properties of Steam and Water gave up its IAPWS 95 equation, and that is the equation which is considered the best today to describe water and steam. So when you talk about all these equations of state, also explain the application of it, and one of the first application that you should talk about is indeed the vapor liquid equilibrium. That means calculation of G minus G star using those equation of state, first with the van der Waals equation and then with the Redlich-Kwong equation. Redlich-Kwong came almost 75 years after van der Waals. In between was the period of all those virial equations, starting with Thiessen and Kamerlingons, and then Benedict-Webb-Rubin and Beatty-Bridgman equations, which do not have two solutions which are useful. They have multiple solutions, but only one is useful. Van der Waals, Redlich-Kwong or Peng-Robinson have three solutions. The middle solution does not represent anything. The upper and lower solutions are vapor phase and liquid phase volumes. And take this opportunity to tell the students that whenever in engineering you have equations, number one, we always know the answer before solving. That means we at least know that it is a positive number, it's a real number, or the upper lower limits of those numbers are already known. And then that there will be multiple solutions to an equation, but not all the solutions of an equation are your answers. It is only that your answer solves that or satisfies that equation. Your answer is one of the solutions of that equation. So every solution to that equation is not our answer. And that is where you start differentiating them from pure mathematics people and engineers. Engineers solve equations to obtain required answers. Mathematicians solve equations because they exist. because the equations exist, they would want to solve answers. And they would never be satisfied with an approximate answer. Whereas engineers will never be satisfied with a no answer. So either an approximate answer, partial answer, or full answer, whichever is possible, engineers will always want the answers. And engineers, fortunately, usually already know the answer or its range, so that we can do a numerical solution starting with an initial guess in the required range and then solve it. What we are going to do in the next session tomorrow is solve a lot of problems using the kind of calculators that students use today. It was about 10-15 years ago that I realized that I learned my chemical engineering using an LED calculator. Then I had switched to the LCD type calculators. Maybe Casio's FX82 or Casio FX100 used to be the typical models I remember using for a long time. And our students about 15 or 20 years ago migrated to some of the more equipped calculators. And some of you are younger people have used those calculators, but many of you are outdated people like me may not have used those modern calculators like FX991 ES or FX991 MS and so on, and would not be knowing the capabilities of those calculators. When I realized that calculator is able to do so many things like solving nonlinear algebraic equations or doing numerical integrations, it was a big discovery for me. Till that time, I would have thought that using a Newton-Raphson method for solving a nonlinear algebraic equation requires a lot of manual iterations or requires a computer. Similarly, numerical integration, I would have thought that it requires a computer. But once I realized the power that FX991 and equivalent calculators have, I started incorporating that in the teaching of a class about how to solve those equations using those calculators, and students enjoy it tremendously because many of the features, although students are using those calculators, they are not really exploited. You'll be surprised that even the storage of intermediate constants into A, B, C, D as variables, which is possible in FX991, many people don't use. Or many people do not use the multiple bracket levels up to 6 levels easily possible in all the calculators. And many people don't use them and end up writing down intermediate answers and plugging them back. And that is where most of the times they go wrong. They enter something wrongly and the answer finally becomes very wrong. Or they round off something unnecessarily in between, thinking that accuracy only of the final answer is required. And in between, if they are rounded off, your final answer is also wrong. So all these things will get avoided once you store the numbers as ABCDs there. And if students are to use that calculator with its capability, then it is essential that we teachers learn that capability first and start using those calculators in that manner faster than them, so that they have the confidence of using it. So tomorrow's session, we are going to do a lot of those calculations, including solving for molar volume with nonlinear equations like this, as well as integrating and finding G minus G star, or the fugacity coefficient for phase equilibrium using the equation of state. We will be doing exercises like this. If I give you TC, PC of water, molecular weight, omega, all these properties are listed in handbooks. So I'll give all the properties and you have to decide which one to use. If you are using Redlich-Kwong equation, then you don't need omega or the DC. Sorry. You have a question? I think it was by mistake. Okay. So with Redlich-Kwong equation, we should make them look up data from handbooks. And as a practice, at least I never give data with the question. Physicochemical data should never be given with the question. Problem-specific data should appear in the problem, but physicochemical data like this, the TC, PC, omega, they should be looking up from tables. So always at the end of the question paper, I provide a big table with a lot of compounds data given. They should pick the compound for which they require that data, and they should pick the data which they require. For example, here, if you are using Redlich-Kwong, you need only TCPC, VC, molecular weight, omega are there in that list, but not required. So we feel this is a very trivial thing, but for them, being able to read those tables, especially when the 10 raised to powers are written at the top, is a practice we need to give them. So one of the earlier exercise with this pressure of steam, which occupies 155 cc's per gram. Experimental value is 1300 kPa, but we will be finding what the answer is. Now, this pressure was the simpler thing to find because it is a pressure explicit equation of state. Next, we are going to look at solving the volume from pressure. And here is where three solutions are possible. And students will tend to use the cubic solving method that is built in these calculators. We should tell them to avoid doing that, because to use that, we have to convert the equation into a particular form of v cube plus v squared plus v plus constant kind of an equation. And we should teach them how to use the numerical nonlinear algebraic equation solving method that calculator has. And how, if you want the liquid phase solution, you have to give a different initial guess, and for the vapor phase solution, a different initial guess. So this would be one of the early problems we will be doing tomorrow also. And what Patil sir is just telling you is something which I had told him earlier, that please make all of the participants aware that we are not going to have just a one-way session like we are having today. Tomorrow, what we are going to do is we will be solving problems, all of us, using that FX991 calculator. And I would be expecting all people to be putting their answers they get on the chat, and we will be proceeding with everybody doing something and not just me doing it on the screen. So please be prepared. I'm sure you would learn something new in the use of calculator when you do it that way. We always expect our students to do it. So it is good that we should be 100% conversant with that calculator and be able to do those calculations with the calculator. Many of you are, so therefore it should not be a problem tomorrow for you. But those of you who are not would definitely enjoy the learning that you will have of use with the calculators. Yes, there is an app which emulates the FX991, which you can download. But if you have a physical FX991 calculator, that is even better. All right, so this is the kind of problem we are going to solve. This very problem we will solve tomorrow. And then we will talk about calculation of G minus G star. The G minus G star, for a pressure explicit equation, we cannot use this because this requires volume as a function of pressure. The integration variable is P, and I have to express the entire integrand in terms of the integration variable. So expressing volume as a function of pressure is not possible with red liquam. It was possible with truncated virial, but not with red liquam. So therefore, I have to transform this equation mathematically using calculus to the other form where it has an integration from infinity volume to V and RT by V minus P. I can substitute this integrand in terms of the integration variable, which is V now. So I can write P in terms of V using the equation of state. V is already V, and therefore I can then use this with this integration from infinity to V. Now, if you do this integration numerically, you cannot do it from infinity. So you have to see what large volume I can use as infinity in this particular case. We will be doing this in the class tomorrow. And with that, we will then obtain the G minus G star. And if you have to solve only for the purpose of vapor liquid equilibrium, G minus G star is RT ln F by P, and therefore fugacity is required for many things. But if it is only for equilibrium of GV and GL, then we can write G minus G star for vapor minus G minus G star for liquid. And a lot of these terms will get cancelled out, and you will simply get P into V vapor minus V liquid minus this integration from V liquid to V vapor PdV is equal to 0. We will be solving this equation also. We will be solving this equation also to obtain the fugacity. This equation also to obtain the vapor liquid equilibrium point for any substance. We will be solving probably for this vapor and liquid coexistence of water. Now, water is a highly polar substance, hydrogen bonded substance. So Redlich-Kwong will not give you a very good answer, but still we will use that, and we'll do it with steam because the values of steam are always given in steam table readily. So you can always check your answer. So we will be doing that calculation. So first solving of the nonlinear algebraic equation for volume, then doing this integration analytically as well as numerically with the help of calculator, then finding out the equilibrium pressure at a given temperature using this equation. So we'll take a substance, another substance, and then we'll say, okay, GL minus G star, GB minus G star. We'll suggest how to start with some initial guess. How do we obtain this initial guess also should be explained. And then with that initial guess, the experimental value is this, find out what value you get with Redlich-Kwong. This problem we will be solving tomorrow. Peng-Robinson and Sohar-Redlich-Kwong equations require a little more complex calculations. So although we can do it a problem in the class with all this as well, but then it will take entire 2-hour lecture to solve a problem. So we will not do it tomorrow, but in the classroom with students, you can definitely do. And once you challenge the students to use the calculator in that way, they will learn doing it and they will surprise you by their ability to use the calculator. These various equations of state to calculate the G minus G star or calculate the fugacity we will be using. And then comes Maxwell equations, which are the main tool for going from conceptual, arriving at conceptual properties, starting with what can be measured. For getting the G minus G star, we did not require the Maxwell equations, but for getting real fluid enthalpy, entropy, internal energy, all these properties, we require the residual, that means the difference from ideal gas and real fluid, for which Maxwell equations are extremely useful. And the paths, which are reversible paths, which are although hypothetical, are very useful in calculating the property differences. That is the next part we will be doing with calculations tomorrow. That means we will be talking about property at state 1 going to property at state 2, and that is done in 3 parts. One is the residual at state 2, another is the residual at state 1, which is the thing which has got cut. It is like this T2 P2, we'll have it residual at T1 P1, and then the transformation of T1 P1 to T2 P2 as an ideal gas, which is much simpler to calculate. And these 3 things together is the property change for the real fluid. Any residual like this is calculated as integral from 0 to P of M ideal gas and real gas coupled together, and then we get the M residual. So we will be calculating residual enthalpy, residual entropy as well. And if time permits, we might even do a turbine calculation of steam entering at a pressure, leaving at some pressure, finding out the real temperature outlet. P2 by P1 raised to gamma minus 1 by gamma is an extremely approximate method which assumes Cp to be constant, gas to be an ideal gas, and then we get that equation for T2 by T1. But the real T2 can be found out with real gas equations of state if you use these computational methods. We will be doing that and with this integration. This is still, we are talking about single component thermodynamics and non-reacting thermodynamics. Unlike our calculation session tomorrow, I have been talking continuously now for almost 55 minutes. I need a break for 5 minutes. Meanwhile, if you have any questions, please put them on the chat. सब चल रहा है लेक्चर भी चल रहा है हाँ मैं थोड़ा सा वही थैंक्स Thanks. No questions? I still need a few minutes to. काय पाटील सर प्रश्न विचारायचे नाही असं सांगितलंय का?
नाही सर, सगळ्यांना सांगितलेलं आहे, एनकरेज केलेलं आहे. ऍक्च्युली you should come out with your questions. Definitely at the end of sessions we'll be having number of questions, sir. No problem. We'll continue after 5 minutes break, sir. Take rest for 5 minutes.
Yes. पाटील सर मे बी या मधल्या 5 मिनिटात रेकॉर्डिंग बंद ठेवलं तरी चालेल.
चालेल सर, चालेल. ओके
Okay, sir. We'll stop the record.
Yes, sir.